You knew the answer before the teacher finished asking, but your hand was already in trouble for the wrong reason. There is a paradox at the center of the ADHD brain, one that neuroscience is only beginning to name clearly. The mind that failed to sit still in school may have been running a faster operating system than the one the classroom was designed for. Tonight, we don't look at the diagnosis. We look at the mechanism underneath it. Why divergent thinking and hyperfocus are not symptoms of a broken brain, but signatures of one that learns differently. Welcome to Psychology for Sleep. Let's leave the noise of the day behind us. If you have ever been told your mind works wrong, you belong here. Subscribe to join our community of healthy sleepers. Before we dive deep, let's take one collective breath together. Inhale peace. Exhale the day. Now, let's look at the exact mechanism behind this. What follows tonight is not a consolation, it is evidence, gathered fact by fact, that the system running in your mind was never the problem. You're in the place where the electric hum of a mind that never fully powers down finally has somewhere to rest. And now we begin. The ADHD brain does not have a dopamine shortage. It has a dopamine timing problem. In a neurotypical brain, dopamine releases steadily as a task begins. A kind of biological runway that builds momentum before the reward arrives. In the ADHD brain, that runway is compressed. Dopamine doesn't arrive until the task becomes urgent, which is why deadlines, novelty, and high-stakes pressure don't create stress in the ADHD brain the way they do in others. They create focus. The system isn't broken. It is calibrated to a different clock. Notice how that reframes every moment you called yourself lazy. Divergent thinking, the ability to generate many possible answers from a single question, is measured in psychology through a test called the alternate uses task. Researchers ask participants how many uses they can find for a brick. Most people stop at 5 or 6. People with ADHD regularly produce 15 to 25. And the answers are rarely predictable. A brick as a pillow, a brick as a musical instrument, a brick as a record of geological time. The ADHD brain does not just think outside the box. It questions whether the box was ever the right shape. That isn't a symptom of distraction. It is the engine of every creative breakthrough that came from the wrong direction. There is a network in the brain called the default mode network, active during rest, daydreaming, and self-reflection. In neurotypical brains, this network quiets when a task begins. In ADHD brains, research consistently shows it does not fully switch off, which means the ADHD mind is running two processes simultaneously: the external task and an internal stream of associations, memories, and ideas at all times. Neuroscientists used to call this a deficit. They are now calling it parallel processing. The mind that appears to be drifting is not absent. It is working two jobs at once and receiving no credit for either. Let that land for a moment. Hyperfocus is perhaps the most misunderstood feature of the ADHD brain. It is not the opposite of the attention deficit. It is the same mechanism operating in the other direction. When the ADHD brain encounters a subject that activates its dopamine system, a problem that matters, a pattern it wants to solve, a creative question with no clean answer. It does not merely focus, it locks. Hours pass. Hunger is ignored. The outside world recedes entirely. Researchers at Massachusetts General Hospital have documented hyperfocus episodes lasting 4 to 6 hours without a single attentional break. The brain that cannot hold a school subject for 20 minutes can hold a problem it loves for an entire night. You've probably already experienced this. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, responsible for planning, impulse control, and time management, develops more slowly in people with ADHD. On average, 3 years more slowly than neurotypical peers. This developmental lag was once interpreted as evidence of a cognitive deficit. It is now being reframed by developmental neuroscientists as an extended window of neuroplasticity, a longer runway during which the brain remains unusually open to restructuring. The brain that appears immature by age 12 may be more adaptable by age 35 than the brain that organized itself earlier. Slower is not always lesser. Sometimes slower is still forming. In a large study analyzing creative achievement data across adults over 2 decades, people with ADHD were significantly more likely to work in creative professions, more likely to report breakthrough ideas, and more likely to describe solving major problems by approaching them from an angle no one else had tried. The researchers concluded that the same cognitive architecture that creates difficulty in structured academic environments may generate a genuine competitive advantage in environments that reward novelty, flexibility, and non-linear association. The classroom was measuring the wrong variable. It always was. There is a concept in cognitive science called cognitive disinhibition, the reduced filtering of information that the brain would normally suppress as irrelevant. In most people, this filtering is tight. The brain decides quickly what doesn't matter and discards it. In people with ADHD, this filter is wider. More raw material enters conscious awareness. More connections are made between things that, to other minds, have nothing to do with each other. Physicist Richard Feynman described his thinking this way. He kept looking at things other people had decided weren't worth looking at. Feynman showed significant ADHD consistent traits throughout his life. The filter other people called a deficit was the source of his greatest contributions. Working memory, the system that holds information in active use, functions differently in ADHD brains. It is often described as leaky. Information enters, but doesn't stay anchored long enough for sequential processing. A neurotypical brain can hold approximately 7 pieces of information in working memory simultaneously. An ADHD brain may hold 3 or 4, but the information that does remain tends to be processed with unusual depth. Research has found that ADHD individuals demonstrate a pattern of narrow but intense processing. Less breadth, but significantly greater depth on retained items. What the ADHD brain holds, it tends to hold completely. That is not a weakness wearing a different name. That is a different architecture. The concept of interest-based nervous system was introduced by psychiatrist Edward Hallowell to describe a fundamental difference in how the ADHD brain allocates attention. Neurotypical brains can direct attention to tasks that are important, expected, or required, regardless of personal interest. The ADHD brain, by contrast, allocates attention almost entirely based on interest, novelty, challenge, urgency, or passion. This is not a motivational failure. It is a neurological reality. The ADHD student who cannot finish a history essay but devours 7 books on a subject they chose is not being difficult. They are showing you exactly how their system works. When the system is given what it actually runs on, let that understanding settle where it needs to settle. Emotional intensity is a feature of ADHD that standard diagnostic criteria have historically underweighted. People with ADHD do not merely feel emotions more frequently, they feel them faster, at greater amplitude, and with less natural buffering between trigger and response. Neuroscientists link this to the same dopaminergic and norepinephrine pathways that affect attention. The system that makes the ADHD brain quick to focus is the same system that makes it quick to feel. In a culture that values emotional restraint, this has been pathologized. In cultures that value emotional depth, creativity, and connection, it has been celebrated. The question was never whether the intensity was appropriate. The question was always whether the environment was calibrated to receive it. There is a documented phenomenon called time blindness in ADHD research, a reduced ability to perceive the passage of time with the same accuracy as neurotypical brains. This is not a memory problem or a planning failure. It is a difference in how the brain's internal clock maps duration. In neurotypical brains, time is felt as a continuous thread. In ADHD brains, time tends to exist in 2 states, now and not now. Deadlines feel abstract until they become immediate. This is why people with ADHD can be chronically late, and also capable of extraordinary last-minute bursts of concentrated work. The mechanism is the same, only the direction has changed. Sleep and ADHD have a relationship that researchers are only beginning to map precisely. Studies consistently show that between half and 3/4 of people with ADHD experience significant sleep difficulties, delayed sleep onset, increased nighttime wakefulness, and vivid or restless dreaming. But the direction of causality is not what most people assume. The ADHD brain does not have sleep problems, despite its differences. It has sleep problems because of them. Specifically because the dopamine system that regulates wakefulness and arousal does not downregulate cleanly at day's end. The brain that is still generating associations at midnight is not misbehaving. It is finishing work it started hours ago. You have probably already found ways to work around this. The relationship between ADHD and high intelligence is more complex than common narratives suggest. ADHD does not cause high intelligence, but the cognitive traits associated with ADHD, divergent thinking, cognitive disinhibition, depth of processing, and tolerance for ambiguity, overlap significantly with traits associated with intellectual giftedness. Research on twice exceptional learners, individuals with both a learning difference and high cognitive ability, shows ADHD is the most common co-occurring profile in this group. The gifted student who struggles in class, the child who asks questions no one prepared an answer for, the person in every room who notices what everyone else has agreed not to see. These are not contradictions. They are the same architecture, operating at different settings. Reward delay aversion. The strong preference for immediate over-delayed reward is one of the most replicated findings in ADHD research. In economics and decision theory, a preference for present reward over future reward is called hyperbolic discounting. All human brains show this tendency. The ADHD brain shows it at significantly higher rates. What this means practically is that traditional incentive structures, work hard now, benefit later, do not activate the ADHD motivational system in the same way. This has been used to explain academic and career underperformance. But the same trait redirected produces something else entirely: a bias toward action, a preference for the concrete over the hypothetical, an intolerance for wasted time. Those are not deficits in most environments. Those are assets. The ADHD brain shows unusual activation patterns in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in error detection, conflict monitoring, and switching between tasks. In neurotypical brains, this region activates briefly when an error is made, then quiets. In ADHD brains, it activates strongly and stays active longer. Researchers believe this may explain the phenomenon of rejection-sensitive dysphoria, an intense, often destabilizing emotional response to perceived criticism or failure. The ADHD brain does not just notice the error, it holds it, processes it at higher amplitude, returns to it involuntarily. The mind that learns quickly from mistakes is the same mind that cannot easily set them down. Notice how much you have been carrying that you never chose to carry. Norepinephrine, the neurotransmitter involved in arousal, attention, and the stress response, functions differently in the ADHD brain. Normal fluctuations in norepinephrine level, the kind that occur with mild stress, novelty, or unexpected challenge, produce alertness and improved focus in most brains. In the ADHD brain, these same fluctuations can produce disproportionate alertness, a state that feels less like focus and more like overwhelm. But there is a narrow band of norepinephrine activation found in moderate challenge, novel problems, and creative pressure, where the ADHD brain performs at levels that exceed neurotypical baselines. Most brains perform best in comfort. The ADHD brain performs best at the edge. That explains more than you might expect about your own history. Language processing in ADHD brains often shows a distinctive pattern called associative chaining, where one thought connects not to the next logical step, but to a related concept several branches away. A conversation about dinner becomes a tangent about food history. A question about directions becomes an observation about urban planning. To outside observers, this appears as distraction. To the ADHD brain, the connections are entirely coherent. Every link makes sense from the inside, even when the path is invisible from the outside. Linguists and creativity researchers have noted that this same chaining pattern is associated with metaphor generation, lateral problem solving, and narrative innovation. The brain that looks like it is wandering is often building a map that other brains can only follow later. Sensory processing in ADHD frequently involves heightened sensitivity to environmental input, light, sound, texture, and temperature register more intensely than in neurotypical nervous systems. This is not a separate condition layered onto ADHD. It is, in many cases, the same neurological profile expressing itself across different domains. The same dopamine and norepinephrine systems that affect attention also regulate sensory gating. The brain's process of deciding what to let through and what to filter out. When that gate is wider, everything comes through. The smell of the room, the weight of the blanket, the particular quality of light through a half-open door. The world is louder and more vivid. That is not a disorder. That is a different resolution. Spontaneous mind wandering, the state of unfocused, internally directed thought, is typically suppressed when a person engages with an external task. In people with ADHD, this suppression is incomplete. The mind continues to generate internal associations even during external activity. This has been studied in the context of creativity. Researchers found that the frequency and richness of spontaneous mind wandering was one of the strongest predictors of creative problem-solving performance. The mind that appears to be absent during the meeting was generating solutions the meeting was not yet asking for. The daydream was not the failure. It was the work, running on a different channel. Let that understanding settle where it needs to settle. There is a growing body of research examining ADHD traits not as pathology but as evolutionary variation. Cognitive profiles that may have conferred survival advantages in ancestral environments requiring novelty seeking, rapid response, and environmental vigilance. Psychologist Tom Hartman proposed what became known as the hunter versus farmer hypothesis. The same traits that make modern structured schooling difficult. Distractibility, impulsivity, high novelty seeking may have made an individual invaluable in environments requiring constant scanning, rapid decision-making, and bold action. The brain was not designed for the classroom. It was designed for terrain. And somewhere in the architecture of the mind you carry tonight, that design is still there, intact, and waiting for the right conditions. The corpus callosum, the band of neural fibers connecting the brain's left and right hemispheres, shows differences in connectivity in ADHD brains. In neurotypical brains, these connections tend to follow well-worn pathways. Information flows efficiently along established routes. In ADHD brains, the connectivity patterns are less predictable, more distributed, more cross-domain. This architectural difference has been proposed as a neurological basis for the unusual cross-domain associations that characterize ADHD thinking. The idea that arrives from music while thinking about mathematics. The solution from architecture applied to social dynamics. The lateral move that, once pointed out, seems obvious to everyone else. The ADHD brain is not connected differently by accident. It is connected differently by design. Researchers studying academic and professional outcomes in ADHD populations have found a pattern they call the late bloomer trajectory. periods of significant underperformance in structured early environments, followed by disproportionate success in self-directed adult contexts. The mechanism appears to be environmental fit. The ADHD brain does not become more capable in adulthood. It finds contexts that match its existing capabilities: creative entrepreneurship, emergency medicine, investigative journalism, fields that reward rapid cognition, tolerance for ambiguity, and the ability to see what conventional thinking missed. The problem was never the brain. It was the mismatch. And for many people in this category, adulthood is simply the moment the match finally happened. Interest-based motivation in the ADHD brain is neurochemically different from effort-based motivation in the neurotypical brain. When an ADHD brain encounters something it finds genuinely interesting, the dopaminergic response is faster, stronger, and more sustained than the response in a neurotypical brain encountering the same material. This is not enthusiasm. It is neurochemistry. The ADHD brain literally experiences more reward from high-interest material, which creates a feedback loop: more reward, more engagement, deeper learning, broader connection-making, more reward. In the right conditions, the ADHD brain does not just learn, it accelerates. The problem was never the speed. It was finding the track. Persistence towards self-directed, intrinsically motivated goals tells a different story than persistence in structured, externally managed contexts. Researchers studying ADHD entrepreneurs, artists, and scientists found that when the goal was personally chosen and genuinely meaningful, persistence rates were comparable, and in some measures exceeded neurotypical peers. The difference was not in the capacity for commitment. It was in what the commitment required. The ADHD brain cannot manufacture motivation for a goal it doesn't own, but for the goal it has chosen, it will carry it further than most. The dopamine system in the ADHD brain shows a distinctive response to learning itself. When new information connects to existing knowledge in unexpected ways, when a fact opens a door rather than closes one, the dopamine release in the ADHD brain is measurably larger than in neurotypical counterparts. This is the central question made visible. Why does the brain society labels as disordered experience more reward from discovery than the brain it calls normal? Because the ADHD brain was not built for instruction. It was built for exploration. And that is exactly what tonight is. What these 25 facts are describing is not a deficit with a silver lining. It is a cognitive architecture that was evaluated by a system it was not designed for. The classroom was not measuring learning. It was measuring compliance with a particular style of learning. And the brain in the room that couldn't comply was often the one running the most interesting process. If you have spent years believing the problem was you now know the assessment was always incomplete. The question was never whether you could learn. It was whether the environment could teach you. Notice the weight your shoulders have been carrying. What the next facts follow is the deeper question. Not what the ADHD brain struggles to do, but what it does when the conditions finally match the machine running inside it. The ADHD brain's relationship with boredom is neurologically distinct from the boredom experienced by neurotypical brains. In most people, boredom is an uncomfortable but manageable state. the brain idles, awaiting input. In the ADHD brain, boredom registers as a form of low-grade pain. Brain imaging studies show that in the absence of stimulation, the ADHD brain's dopamine levels drop more sharply and more rapidly than in neurotypical brains. The fidgeting, the channel switching, the inability to sit through a lecture, these are not behavioral failures. They are the brain's attempts to self-medicate a dopamine deficit in real time. What looks like restlessness from the outside is a nervous system doing the only thing it knows how to do to stay functional. Researchers studying ADHD across cultures have found that the expression of ADHD traits varies significantly by context, and that some environments effectively eliminate the functional impairment associated with ADHD while leaving the cognitive profile intact. In hunter-gatherer communities studied in Kenya, individuals carrying ADHD-associated genetic variants showed better nutritional outcomes and greater social status than their neurotypical counterparts. The diagnosis is not universal. The trait is. What changes is the environment's relationship to the trait. A brain that struggles in a classroom may be exactly the brain a different kind of community was built around. The concept of twice exceptional learners, students who are both gifted and learning different, reveals something important about how cognitive assessments have historically been structured. Standard intelligence testing was designed to measure performance in domains that ADHD directly impairs: sustained attention, sequential processing, working memory under time pressure. It was not designed to measure what ADHD does not impair: spatial reasoning, conceptual integration, creative problem solving, and the ability to find patterns in noise. Many ADHD individuals score average or below average on IQ tests, while demonstrating abilities that the test simply was not measuring. The instrument was calibrated for one kind of mind. It was presented as the measure of all minds. Executive function, the cluster of cognitive abilities that includes planning, impulse, control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, is the domain most consistently affected in ADHD. But executive function is not a single capacity. It is a family of related but distinct abilities. Research consistently shows that people with ADHD demonstrate uneven executive function profiles. Profound deficits in some areas alongside preserved or enhanced abilities in others. Cognitive flexibility. In particular, the ability to switch between mental frameworks rapidly and fluidly is often intact or superior in ADHD populations. The brain that cannot plan 3 steps ahead can pivot in real time, faster than almost anyone else. In a stable, predictable environment, that is a deficit. In a changing one, it is an advantage. The ADHD brain's sensitivity to novelty is mediated by the dopamine system in a way that creates a particular kind of learning profile. Novel information produces a dopamine spike. Familiar information produces very little. This means the ADHD brain is a rapid initial learner. It absorbs new material quickly when motivation is high, but struggles with the repetitive practice required to consolidate learning into long-term memory through conventional means. Traditional education is designed around repetition and consolidation. The ADHD brain needs novelty at every step to stay engaged. Not because it is lazy, because it is running on a fuel that repetition does not provide. Let that understanding settle where it needs to settle. Impulsivity in a ADHD is typically framed as a failure of inhibition, an inability to stop a response before it is expressed. But researchers studying decision-making in ADHD populations have found something more nuanced. In low-stakes, familiar situations, ADHD impulsivity produces poor outcomes. In high-stakes, novel situations requiring rapid response, ADHD impulsivity produces outcomes that are frequently superior to those of deliberate, reflective decision-makers. Emergency room physicians with ADHD traits have been documented to perform better under sudden time pressure. Entrepreneurs with ADHD traits make faster pivots when circumstances change unexpectedly. The trait that creates friction in everyday life creates advantage in exactly the conditions that matter most. Metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking, is an area of genuine difficulty for many people with ADHD. The same executive systems that support planning and monitoring also support the ability to observe and regulate one's own cognitive processes. When those systems are less reliable, self-monitoring becomes inconsistent. This is why ADHD individuals often underestimate how long a task will take, overestimate how much they have done, and find it genuinely difficult to predict their own behavior in new contexts. But this difficulty has a counterpart: the ADHD brain. Precisely because it is not tightly self-monitoring, is also less likely to second-guess a creative instinct before it becomes an action. The inner critic that stops most people sometimes doesn't arrive fast enough to stop the ADHD brain. That is not always a problem. The relationship between ADHD and risk-taking has been extensively studied and consistently misframed. ADHD is associated with higher rates of risk-taking behavior across adolescence and early adulthood. This has been attributed to impulsivity and poor judgment. But controlled studies separating sensation-seeking from impulsivity find a different picture. ADHD individuals show elevated sensation-seeking, a desire for novel, varied, and complex experience that is distinct from poor impulse control. Sensation-seeking, without impulsivity, is associated with creativity, entrepreneurship, and exploration. The ADHD brain does not take risks because it fails to calculate consequences. It takes risks because it is genuinely drawn toward the edge of the known. That is a different thing entirely. Sleep onset in ADHD brains is delayed not just behaviorally but neurologically. The circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that governs sleep-wake cycles, tends to run later in people with ADHD, independent of habits or choices. This is called delayed sleep phase syndrome, and it co-occurs with ADHD at rates significantly above the general population. The ADHD brain is not choosing to stay awake. Its clock is set differently. The night owl who cannot fall asleep before 2 in the morning may be fighting a biological reality, not a bad habit. And the brain that finally quiets after midnight often produces its clearest thinking in those hours. because the external world has finally slowed down enough to match its pace. The ADHD brain shows a distinctive pattern in how it processes feedback: positive feedback, praise, recognition, evidence of success. Produces a dopamine response that is larger and more immediate than in neurotypical brains. Negative feedback, criticism, failure, disappointment, produces a norepinephrine response that is also larger and more sustained. This asymmetry means the ADHD brain is simultaneously more responsive to encouragement and more vulnerable to discouragement than most. It needs more of the former to stay motivated. It takes longer to recover from the latter. This is not weakness. It is the same sensitivity that makes the ADHD brain excellent at reading emotional dynamics, responding to human connection, and caring deeply about the work it does. The dial goes in both directions. It was never broken. Cognitive load. The amount of information the brain is actively processing at any given moment is managed differently in ADHD brains. In neurotypical brains, irrelevant information is actively suppressed, keeping cognitive load manageable. In ADHD brains, suppression is less efficient, meaning more information stays in active processing simultaneously. This increases cognitive load under ordinary conditions. But it also means that when a problem requires integrating information from multiple unrelated domains, the ADHD brain has an unexpected advantage. It has been holding more threads than it was asked to hold. When those threads suddenly connect, the insight is not random. It is the product of a mind that never stopped carrying everything at once. The ADHD brain's response to music is neurologically distinct from that of neurotypical brains. Music activates the dopamine system, and for the ADHD brain, this activation is especially powerful. Many people with ADHD report that music is one of the most reliable tools for entering and sustaining a focused state. Neuroimaging research supports this. Music appears to provide a form of external dopamine scaffolding for the ADHD brain, filling in the motivational runway that the brain cannot generate internally in low stimulation environments. The student who needs headphones to study is not being antisocial. They are using sound the way other brains use quiet, as the condition under which thinking becomes possible. Physical movement has a neurochemical relationship with the ADHD brain that goes beyond general health benefits. Exercise raises dopamine and norepinephrine levels in the prefrontal cortex. The same effect achieved by stimulant medications used to treat ADHD. Studies have found that brief, moderate exercise before cognitive tasks produces measurable improvements in attention, working memory, and executive function in ADHD populations, sometimes comparable in magnitude to medication effects. The child who cannot sit still in class and who is performing better after recess is not demonstrating a behavioral problem. They are demonstrating a neurological need that the environment is not designed to accommodate. Pattern recognition, the ability to identify structure, regularity, and relationship within complex or ambiguous information, appears to be a relative strength in many ADHD populations. This aligns with what is known about cognitive disinhibition and parallel processing when more raw information enters awareness. And when cross-domain associations are made more readily, the likelihood of recognizing non-obvious patterns increases. Scientists, detectives, market analysts, and diagnosticians, fields built on finding the signal within the noise, show elevated rates of ADHD traits in their practitioners. The brain that cannot filter out irrelevant information is sometimes the brain that notices what everyone else missed because they were filtering too hard. The concept of flow, the state of complete absorption in a task, characterized by effortlessness, altered time perception, and peak performance, was described by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi as the optimal human experience. People with ADHD enter flow states, but the conditions required are different. Neurotypical individuals can enter flow in tasks of moderate challenge and interest. ADHD individuals typically require higher novelty, higher personal relevance, and a closer match between their skills and the challenge level. When those conditions are met, the ADHD brain does not merely enter flow. It tends to go deeper, stay longer, and produce more within that state than most brains are capable of sustaining. The ADHD brain was not built for average conditions. It was built for this. The pharmaceutical treatment of ADHD works broadly by increasing available dopamine and norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex, bringing the neurochemical environment closer to what neurotypical brains maintain naturally. This is useful to know, not because it confirms ADHD as a deficit, but because it clarifies what the ADHD brain is actually working against. It is not working against laziness or lack of effort. It is working against a neurochemical baseline that makes effort feel costlier than it does for other brains. Every task the ADHD brain completes without the conditions it needs represents an expenditure of effort that neurotypical brains do not make. That is not a character flaw. That is running a system harder than it was designed to run and completing the work anyway. Social perception, the ability to read emotional cues, infer intentions, and navigate interpersonal dynamics, shows an interesting profile in ADHD research. On standardized tests of social cognition administered in calm, controlled conditions, ADHD individuals often perform at or below average, but in real-world, emotionally charged social environments, the picture shifts. The heightened emotional sensitivity, faster emotional processing, and greater attunement to non-verbal cues that characterize ADHD produce social perception that is often faster, more accurate, and more emotionally nuanced than standardized measures capture. The ADHD brain reads the room before the test begins. It was just never given credit for what it found there. Hypersensitivity to rejection. The phenomenon researchers call rejection-sensitive dysphoria affects an estimated majority of people with ADHD, though it rarely appears in formal diagnostic criteria. The experience is described as an instantaneous, overwhelming emotional pain triggered by perceived criticism, disapproval, or social exclusion, even when the perception may not accurately reflect the situation. This is not a personality trait or a learned response. It is a neurological feature, connected to the same dopamine and norepinephrine dysregulation that affects attention. The person who reacts most intensely to feeling misunderstood is often the person who is most acutely attuned to the emotional states of others. The sensitivity that creates the wound is the same sensitivity that creates the gift. The relationship between ADHD and creativity has been studied across multiple domains: visual art, music, writing, scientific innovation, and entrepreneurship. Across these domains, a consistent pattern emerges. ADHD traits correlate with creative output when the environment supports autonomy, when the work is intrinsically motivated, and when evaluation pressure is low. Under those conditions, the cognitive disinhibition, divergent thinking, and associative chaining that characterize ADHD produce more original, more varied, and more unexpected output than neurotypical comparison groups. The ADHD brain was not made for examination conditions. It was made for the studio, the laboratory, the open field of a problem no one has solved yet. Give it the right conditions, and it will show you what it was always capable of. There is a documented phenomenon in ADHD research called interest-triggered hyperfocus in social contexts. The experience of becoming completely absorbed in another person, their ideas, their story, or their emotional world. In relationships, this can look like extraordinary empathy, full presence, deep listening, and the ability to hold another person's experience with a completeness that other people rarely offer. It can also look like inconsistency, because when the interest or novelty fades, so does the attention. But the capacity underneath is real. The ADHD brain can be completely present. It needs the conditions that activate its full engagement. That is not a flaw in the capacity for connection. That is the nature of how this particular kind of depth works. The neurological overlap between ADHD and other neurodevelopmental profiles, autism, dyslexia, sensory processing differences, and giftedness, is substantial. Researchers increasingly view these not as separate conditions with occasional co-occurrence, but as overlapping expressions of a broader continuum of cognitive variation. This means that many people diagnosed with ADHD also carry traits from adjacent profiles, and that the combination often produces cognitive profiles that are genuinely unusual in their strengths and challenges. The person who has spent a lifetime not fitting any single category may be someone whose mind operates across several of them simultaneously, not fragmented, multiply, configured. Attention regulation in ADHD is not simply a matter of too little attention. It is a matter of poorly modulated attention. Attention that swings between extremes rather than settling into a sustainable middle range. The ADHD brain can be completely unable to focus on a low-interest task, and completely unable to disengage from a high-interest one. Both ends of this spectrum are caused by the same underlying regulatory difference. What the world calls an attention deficit is more accurately described as an attention dysregulation, a system that runs at full power or not at all, with very little stable ground between. And in a world that increasingly values deep work, the ability to run at full power, when directed correctly, is not a small thing. The ADHD brain's sensitivity to consequences, both positive and negative, creates a distinctive motivational profile that standard workplace and educational structures are poorly designed to accommodate. Most institutions reward consistency, incremental progress, and tolerance for delay. The ADHD brain is motivated by immediacy, novelty, personal meaning, and visible impact. When these elements are absent, performance drops dramatically. When they are present, even in institutional contexts, performance often exceeds expectations. The employee who misses routine deadlines but delivers exceptional work under a challenge they genuinely care about is not unreliable. They are running on a different fuel source. The question the environment needs to ask is whether it has been providing the right fuel. Long-term outcomes for people with ADHD are more strongly predicted by environmental fit than by symptom severity. Studies following ADHD-diagnosed individuals into adulthood consistently find that those who found work, relationships, and creative outlets that matched their cognitive style showed outcomes indistinguishable from, and sometimes superior to, neurotypical comparison groups. Those who did not, who spent their lives in environments demanding what their brain was not structured to provide, showed elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and underachievement. The brain was not the variable that determined the outcome. The match was. And the central question this raises tonight is the same one the research keeps arriving at: what might become possible when the right conditions finally appear? Learning itself, the act of acquiring new knowledge and integrating it into existing frameworks, produces different neurochemical signatures in ADHD brains than in neurotypical ones. In neurotypical brains, learning is a gradual process. Information is encoded, rehearsed, consolidated, retrieved. In ADHD brains, learning often happens in sudden integrations, moments when scattered pieces of information suddenly cohere into a pattern that was not visible before. This is why the ADHD learner may appear to have absorbed nothing for weeks, and then demonstrate mastery that surprises everyone, including themselves. The learning was happening. It was just happening on a different timeline, in a different form, toward a different kind of knowing. Halfway through, and what the science keeps returning to, fact after fact, domain after domain, is the same finding restated in 50 different ways. This brain was not failing. It was operating correctly in conditions it was never designed for. If you have been wondering whether any of this actually changes anything, the answer the research gives is yes, but slowly. The way a different kind of light changes what you can see in the same room, which means something has already shifted. Tonight, let that understanding settle where it needs to settle. What the second half follows is the harder question. Not whether this brain can learn, but what happens to a mind that has spent years learning to believe the wrong thing about itself. The ADHD brain carries a particular kind of accumulated weight that neurotypical brains do not. By some clinical estimates, by adulthood, most people with ADHD have received around 20,000 more negative messages about their behavior, attention, and abilities than their neurotypical peers. 20,000 corrections, 20,000 redirections, 20,000 moments of being told, in some form, that the way they were was not right. This does not leave the brain unchanged. The neurological signature of chronic criticism is real. It reshapes the stress response, lowers the threshold for rejection sensitivity, and creates a persistent background signal of inadequacy that has nothing to do with the brain's actual capabilities. What you carry tonight may not be yours. It may simply be what was handed to you. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize its structure and function in response to experience, is elevated in ADHD brains throughout life. The same extended developmental window that delays prefrontal cortex maturation also keeps the brain more responsive to environmental input for longer. This means that the interventions, environments, and experiences that reach the ADHD brain later in life can produce structural changes that would not be possible in a neurotypical brain of the same age. The brain that was told it was fixed is, in fact, unusually open. The story was never finished. It was waiting for better conditions. Identity formation in ADHD often follows an interrupted pattern, the normal process of adolescent identity development, trying on roles, testing values, building a coherent self-concept, is disrupted when the dominant feedback from the environment is evaluative failure. Many ADHD adults describe a sense of delayed or incomplete identity formation, a feeling of not yet knowing who they are, or of being multiple contradictory selves that never resolved into a single coherent person. Research suggests this is a common developmental consequence of ADHD in unsupportive environments. Not a character deficit, but an identity that was interrupted before it had the conditions to complete itself. The ADHD brain's relationship to shame is different in kind, not just degree, from what most people experience. Shame in the neurotypical brain is a painful but discrete experience. It arises in specific contexts, motivates corrective behavior, and resolves. In the ADHD brain, shame tends to become chronic and pervasive, a background state rather than a situational response. This is partly because of the volume of negative feedback received, and partly because the ADHD brain's rejection sensitivity amplifies each instance of failure beyond what the moment objectively warranted. The shame is not evidence of who you are. It is evidence of how many times the same wound was opened before anyone understood what was causing it. Masking, the deliberate suppression of neurodivergent traits in social and professional contexts, is a significant source of cognitive and emotional fatigue in ADHD adults. Masking requires continuous conscious effort monitoring behavior, suppressing impulses, modulating speech rate, managing eye contact, performing attentiveness. Each of these normally automatic functions must be manually operated. The cognitive load of masking across a full workday has been compared to the effort of conducting a task in a second language for 8 hours. The exhaustion ADHD adults report at the end of a conventional day is not weakness. It is the cost of translation, of running an authentic system through a filter it was never designed to need. Research on emotional regulation in ADHD reveals a consistent pattern. The intensity of emotional experience is not the problem. The lag in emotional recovery is. Neurotypical brains activate and return to baseline relatively quickly after an emotional event. ADHD brains activate just as quickly, often more so. But the return to baseline is slower. The emotional wave arrives at the same time. It just takes longer to recede. This means that what looks like overreaction in the moment is often simply a longer reverberation of a feeling that was entirely appropriate to begin with. The ADHD brain is not reacting wrong. It is resonating longer. The concept of interoception, the brain's ability to sense and interpret signals from within the body, is an area of emerging research in ADHD. People with ADHD consistently show reduced interoceptive accuracy. They are less reliably aware of hunger, thirst, fatigue, and physical discomfort until those states become acute. This contributes to the pattern of forgetting to eat, missing signs of exhaustion, and crashing hard after extended periods of exertion. But interoceptive differences also mean that the ADHD brain can sustain effort through conditions of discomfort that would signal other brains to stop. The mind that doesn't notice it's tired keeps working long after the neurotypical mind would have stopped. That is its own kind of endurance. The ADHD brain's dopamine system creates a distinctive relationship with meaning. Neurotypical brains can sustain effort toward meaningful long-term goals even when day-to-day motivation is absent. The ADHD brain needs meaning to be present, felt, and immediate, not abstract and distant. This is why ADHD individuals often perform at their highest in contexts where purpose is viscerally felt, a cause they believe in, a person they are protecting, a problem that genuinely matters. Not because they are more selfish than other people, because their motivational system runs on felt meaning, not conceptual meaning. And felt meaning, when it is real, produces a quality of effort that other motivational systems rarely match. The ADHD brain's relationship to memory is non-linear in ways that create both disadvantage and unexpected depth. Episodic memory. The recall of personal experiences tends to be fragmented and inconsistently accessible. But semantic memory, knowledge, concepts, patterns, tends to be stored associatively rather than sequentially. This means ADHD recall works through connection. A fact triggers a related concept, which triggers an experience, which triggers an insight. The path to the memory is longer and less predictable, but the memory, when accessed, often arrives with more context, more connection, and more meaning attached to it than the original event contained. The ADHD brain does not remember in a straight line. It remembers in a web. Problem solving in ADHD populations shows a characteristic pattern that researchers call non-linear convergence. The tendency to approach a problem from multiple unrelated angles simultaneously before any single solution becomes apparent. Where neurotypical problem solvers tend to move from problem to hypothesis to test to conclusion, ADHD problem solvers tend to hold many partial hypotheses simultaneously. Allow them to interact, and wait for the point at which one suddenly dominates. This process is slower in the early stages and faster in the later ones. It produces a different distribution of insight. And it generates solutions that sequential thinking would not have found, because sequential thinking would have eliminated the right answer before reaching it. The ADHD brain's response to uncertainty is opposite to what is commonly assumed. Most people find uncertainty aversive. They prefer to know, even when the known outcome is worse than the uncertain one. ADHD individuals show significantly higher tolerance for ambiguity and significantly more comfort with open-ended, unresolved situations than neurotypical comparison groups. This tolerance is not a failure to understand consequences. It is a genuine cognitive preference for the open field over the closed one. In a world that increasingly requires comfort with ambiguity, complex systems, evolving information, rapidly changing conditions, this trait is not a liability. It is a precondition for the kind of thinking the world increasingly needs. The relationship between ADHD and humor is consistently noted in clinical and research literature, but rarely studied formally. People with ADHD demonstrate elevated rates of comedic creativity, the ability to find and generate humor in unexpected juxtapositions, subverted expectations, and cross-domain associations. This is likely connected to the same cognitive disinhibition and divergent thinking that characterizes ADHD more broadly. The connection that produces a joke is structurally similar to the connection that produces a creative insight. Both require the brain to hold two apparently unrelated things until the moment of convergence becomes visible. The ADHD brain has always been making those connections. Sometimes the connection makes people laugh. Sometimes it changes how a field thinks. The mechanism is identical. Many adults with ADHD describe a lifelong sense of existing slightly out of phase with the world around them, as if operating at a different rhythm, a different speed, a different frequency than the people and institutions they move through. This experience has a neurological basis. The ADHD brain's internal clock, its dopamine timing, its sensory processing speed, and its attention modulation all operate at settings that diverge from the statistical norm. The person who has always felt slightly out of step was not imagining the difference. They were accurately perceiving it. And the question that remains, the central question has been asking all night, is whether out of step is a problem with the person, or a problem with the assumption that everyone must move at the same pace. Academic research on ADHD has historically focused almost exclusively on the deficits, symptoms, and impairments of the condition. A newer generation of researchers, using strengths-based frameworks, has begun examining what ADHD populations do better, not despite their neurology, but because of it. The findings are consistent, elevated, divergent thinking, superior performance under time pressure, greater tolerance for ambiguity, faster initial learning of novel material, stronger emotional attunement, more original creative output. These are not compensatory strategies. They are expressions of the same architecture that creates the challenges. You cannot remove the difficulties without also removing the gifts. They were always the same thing. The big idea of tonight can be stated plainly now. ADHD is not a deficit of attention. It is an excess of it, distributed across too many things simultaneously, calibrated to a different reward system, running on a fuel that ordinary conditions rarely provide. The mind that appears unfocused from the outside is often the mind that is most deeply engaged with everything, all at once, at a resolution most brains never access. What was called a disorder was always closer to a different design, and every design has the conditions under which it performs best. Tonight has been part of finding them. Sleep quality in ADHD adults is shaped by more than the delayed circadian rhythm, the brain's inability to down-regulate stimulation at day's end, to complete the mental loops that remain open, to release the associations still in active processing, means that sleep onset is resisted not just biologically, but cognitively. The mind that cannot stop making connections also cannot stop making them at night. Practices that help neurotypical people sleep: reading, relaxing, winding down, have limited effect on the ADHD brain unless they provide sufficient cognitive engagement to occupy the processing that would otherwise prevent sleep. This is not unusual behavior. It is the brain's last act of the day, completing what it started, in the only time it has left. The ADHD brain's hypersensitivity to sound during sleep onset is a documented phenomenon. The same sensory gating differences that cause daytime sound sensitivity also operate at night. Sounds that neurotypical brains filter out: a distant conversation, a fan, ambient noise, remain in active processing in the ADHD brain, competing with the process of falling asleep. This is why many ADHD individuals sleep better with consistent background sound, music, white noise, spoken word. Not because they need distraction, because the brain requires something to process in order to stop processing everything else. The input is not the problem. Silence is. The default mode network, the brain's internal narrative system, is unusually active during sleep in ADHD brains. This contributes to the vivid, complex, and often narratively elaborate dreaming frequently reported by people with ADHD. Dreams in ADHD often feature rapid scene changes, emotionally intense content, and the same kind of associative leaping that characterizes ADHD waking cognition. The brain does not stop being itself during sleep. It continues its characteristic mode of processing, freely associative, emotionally amplified, rich with connection, in a context where those qualities produce not distraction, but narrative. The ADHD brain at night is not disordered. It is creative, in the dark, where no one told it to stop. Restoration during sleep serves particular functions for ADHD brains that go beyond what general sleep science describes. The prefrontal cortex, consistently the most depleted region after a day of ADHD-related effortful self-regulation, is also the region most dependent on sleep for restoration. Slow-wave sleep, in particular, is associated with the metabolic clearing of waste products from exactly the neural regions that ADHD taxes most heavily. Sleep for the ADHD brain is not rest. It is maintenance, targeted, and deeply restorative in a way that no waking activity can replicate. The hours you are moving toward tonight are doing something specific for this specific brain. Let them. The ADHD brain's processing of praise and positive reinforcement during learning has implications for how it consolidates memory overnight. Sleep-dependent memory consolidation is enhanced when the material being consolidated was learned in a state of positive arousal, when dopamine was high, when engagement was genuine for the ADHD brain. This means that learning acquired during a hyperfocus state or during an interest-driven exploration is consolidated more effectively during subsequent sleep than learning acquired under pressure or obligation. Tonight's facts were encountered with the dopamine that genuine curiosity provides. That is not irrelevant. The brain consolidates what it valued, and it is about to begin. The relationship between physical rest and cognitive function in ADHD shows a pattern rarely discussed. The ADHD brain is not well served by partial rest, the half-sleep, the interrupted night, the nap that doesn't complete. It requires full sleep cycles to complete the processing that its high baseline cognitive load generates. Each incomplete cycle leaves more unfinished than it does in neurotypical brains. The ADHD brain that is consistently underslept does not merely perform worse. It loses access to exactly the capacities: emotional regulation, executive function, impulse control that it needs most in order to function. Sleep is not optional for this brain. It is the mechanism by which it remains capable. And tonight, you are giving it what it needs. Memory reconsolidation, the process by which existing memories are temporarily destabilized and then rewritten during recall, is enhanced during sleep. For the ADHD brain, this process carries particular significance. The chronic negative experiences associated with ADHD, the corrections, the failures, the accumulated weight of being told the wrong thing for too long, are stored as emotional memories. Sleep-based reconsolidation provides a nightly opportunity for those memories to be reprocessed, not erased, but integrated differently, less raw, less immediate, more contained within a larger context of what is also true. The brain heals during sleep, and this brain, more than most, has something specific to heal. The hours before sleep, the transition state between waking and rest, are neurologically significant for ADHD brains in ways that differ from the neurotypical experience. As dopamine levels naturally decline in the evening, the ADHD brain often experiences a paradoxical state, less regulated, more emotionally volatile, more likely to ruminate, and more likely to revisit the day's failures with disproportionate intensity. This is not the person at their most accurate. It is the neurochemistry at its most depleted. The thoughts that arrive in this window, the criticisms, the doubts, the replaying of what went wrong, are not assessments. They are artifacts of a brain running low on the chemical it uses to regulate itself. They do not require response. They require sleep. Throughout history, individuals demonstrating what we now recognize as ADHD, consistent cognitive profiles, have been disproportionately represented among innovators, explorers, artists, and founders. Thomas Edison, Benjamin Franklin, Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein. The documentation is retrospective and inferential. We cannot diagnose the dead, but the pattern is consistent minds that could not be contained within conventional structures, that pursued interest with an intensity others found baffling, that connected things no one else was connecting, that needed the right conditions to produce what they were always capable of. The diagnosis is modern, the brain is ancient, and the brain that felt wrong for so long has been changing the world for as long as the world has needed changing. And here is what the science has been building toward all night. ADHD is not a failure of focus. It is a different relationship with attention, one calibrated to interest, novelty, meaning, and connection rather than obligation, sequence, and compliance. The same architecture that created difficulty created everything else. The divergent thinking, the hyperfocus, the emotional depth, the pattern recognition, the tolerance for ambiguity, the drive toward the edge of what is known. These are not compensations for a deficit. They are the deficit and the gift. Inseparably, indistinguishable, produced by the same brain, running exactly the way it was built to run. The central question this night began with was always already answered. The brain society called disordered was the brain that refused to be ordinary. 75 facts in, and what they collectively describe is not a condition to be managed. It is a mind to be understood, finally, fully, and without apology. The science did not discover something new tonight. It named something that was always there, waiting for the right language. What you couldn't know by being told, the facts did slowly, across this hour, by changing what your mind now holds about itself. Not how you feel, what you know. That distinction is the whole thing. Notice the weight your shoulders have been carrying. What the final facts carry is different. They don't explain anymore. They only confirm what was always true about the mind that brought you here tonight. The ADHD brain in rest is not at rest. It is in a state of active internal generation, associations forming, connections being tested, unfinished thoughts completing themselves. This is the default mode network at full operation. What looks like stillness from the outside is the mind's most productive state, the condition under which the unconscious work that waking effort could not complete quietly resolves. Creativity and ADHD share a neurological mechanism, the reduced suppression of associative thinking that allows unrelated ideas to make contact. Every creative act requires this. Every breakthrough in art, in science, in human understanding, required a mind that did not discard the connection before it had the chance to matter. The ADHD brain has never been good at discarding. That was always its gift. The emotional depth of the ADHD experience is not incidental. The same neural circuits that create attentional dysregulation also create the capacity for profound empathy, for feeling another person's experience as if it were your own, for caring about things with an intensity that other people sometimes find difficult to understand. This is not a side effect. It is the same thing, and it has always been worth having. Across all the research on ADHD, one finding remains consistent. The outcome is determined not by the brain, but by what the brain encounters, the right environment, the right conditions, The right moment when a mind that had been running against resistance finally finds the surface it was designed for. That moment is possible. The research says so. And some part of tonight has been part of finding it. The mind that could not be still was learning in the only way it knew. It followed what was alive in the moment and let go of what was not. To the people watching, this looked like a failure of discipline. From the inside, it was the only method that ever worked. Attention given freely to what genuinely held it. That was never the absence of a strategy. That was the strategy, running exactly as it was built to. What the world called inattention was attention, directed inward, or sideways, or forward in time, toward things not yet visible to the people in the room. The mind was not failing to look, it was looking somewhere else, at something the room had not yet learned to see. And often, what it found there arrived years before anyone else thought to ask the question. The ADHD brain does not run out of ideas. It runs out of the conditions that allow ideas to become action. The structure, the deadline, the felt sense that this one matters right now. Give it those conditions. And the ideas were never the limiting factor. They were always there, waiting in greater supply than any single day could ever use. There is no version of this brain that would have been the same mind without the intensity, the sensitivity, the divergence. The traits are not separable from the gifts they produce. You cannot subtract the difficulty and somehow keep the depth. The brain you have is the brain you have, entirely. And it was never a rough draft of someone else. The criticism you received across all those years was about the fit between you and a system that measured one narrow kind of mind. It was never a verdict on your intelligence, your worth, or your capacity to learn well. The mind was never the problem here. The mismatch was, and a mismatch is something the world can still change. Everything this brain learned, it learned its own way, through connection, through obsession, through the long detour that arrived at the answer from the other side. That is not a lesser kind of learning. That is a deeper one. The stillness coming now is not the silence of a brain that finally stopped. It is the silence of a brain that has been given permission to stop performing wakefulness, to stop monitoring, translating, and holding itself to a standard built for a different design. This quiet is not absence. It is the system, at last, at rest in its own language. You do not need to solve anything tonight. The brain at rest is already working on everything you need, without effort, without instruction. That is what sleep does for this particular mind. The sensitivity that made things harder is the same sensitivity that made you capable of things most people will never attempt. Both of those things are true. They always were. Every fact tonight was already inside this brain in some form, as a feeling without a name, as an experience without an explanation. The science only caught up. The divergent thinking, the pattern recognition, the depth of feeling, the refusal to accept the obvious answer when a better one might still be hiding somewhere out of view. These were never symptoms of something broken in you. They were always signatures of something rare. The same signatures that, in the right hands and the right hour, have moved entire fields forward. Let the body be heavy now. Let the thoughts slow. There is nothing the mind needs to hold on to tonight that will not still be there tomorrow. changed slightly. By the work, sleep is already beginning. The brain that brought you here tonight has been asking the same question for a long time. Am I enough? The answer the science gives is that the question was always the wrong one. The brain was never measured against the right scale. What you carry into sleep tonight is different from what you carried at the beginning. Not lighter, necessarily, but differently understood. And understanding changes what the weight means. The connections still forming at the edge of awareness. Let them form. Let them complete themselves quietly in the space between waking and rest. That is where the best ones always arrive. The mind that never fully powers down is powering down now. Not because it was forced to, because it found somewhere it no longer needs to defend itself. What tonight was about was never really the facts. It was the permission to stop seeing this brain as the problem that needed solving, and to start seeing it as the solution that needed the right question. ADHD is not a deficit of attention. It is attention in its most complete form, offered to everything, drawn toward what is alive, capable of depths that steady. Sequential minds were simply not built to reach. You have been carrying a superpower in a world that kept handing you the wrong instruction manual. Sleep now. The brain that brought you here tonight is exactly the brain it was always supposed to be. The brain was not failing in those classrooms. It was waiting for problems worth the intensity it carried, for conditions that could receive what it was offering, for a context in which the way it worked was not an obstacle but an asset. What tonight did was not change the brain. It changed the frame. The divergent thinking was always there. The hyperfocus was always there. The depth of feeling, the pattern recognition, the tolerance for ambiguity that the world increasingly needs. Always there. This is what the science arrives at. Fact after fact, study after study, ADHD is not a broken version of a normal brain. It is a different version of an intelligent one, and the journey toward finding the conditions where that brain thrives. That journey is not over. It has, perhaps, been clearer tonight than it has ever been before. The ADHD Sleepy Facts playlist has been returning to exactly this territory. The science of minds that work differently, and what that difference actually means. The next video carries this further. That video is waiting whenever you are ready. The connections are quieter now than they were an hour ago. Not because they stopped, because they found somewhere to land. Let your shoulders release the last of what they were holding. Sleep carries you to where the operating system finally runs without instruction, processing in the background, consolidating what tonight made visible, filing the facts not as information, but as something closer to permission. But if your eyes are closed, stay there. Rest well. Gentle mind. You gave this brain what it needed tonight. Not a fix. A witness. Where curiosity ends and sleep begins. Good night.